The late spring sunlight filtered into the modest suburban home through the half-closed blinds, throwing scattered shadows across the hardwood floor. Daniel Harper sat at the dining table, pen tapping rhythmically against his legal pad. He was preparing for an upcoming client meeting, yet his mind remained stubbornly distracted. His wife, Sarah, was upstairs resting, pregnant with their first child and radiant even in her exhaustion. Life, Daniel thought, had been kind. As the clock ticked closer to 5 in the evening, Daniel decided to take a break. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee, letting the familiar scent anchor him in the moment. The sound of footsteps on the stairs drew his attention. Sarah appeared, wearing one of his oversized flannel shirts that barely covered her growing belly. Her hair was loose, framing a face that held both a glow of anticipation and shadows of fatigue. "Hey," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "Hey yourself," he replied, moving to greet her with a kiss on the forehead. "Feeling better?" "A little. Baby's been restless today." She placed a hand on her stomach, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe she's as impatient as her dad." Daniel chuckled. "Impatience is a family trait. Let me grab you some tea." As he moved to the kitchen, he thought he heard a faint hum of voices. It took him a moment to realize it wasn't the TV, it was coming from the living room. Curious, Daniel approached the source. His steps faltered when he recognized the second voice, his mother-in-law, Margaret. She must have arrived while he was upstairs earlier. The door to the living room was slightly ajar, allowing the voices to drift out. He hesitated, not wanting to intrude but unable to resist catching snippets of their conversation. "You have to stay strong," Margaret's voice insisted, firm yet soothing. "This is all for the best." "But Mom," Sarah's voice cracked, carrying an edge of worry. "No buts. Listen to me. You'll have everything you need once the baby is born. He's a walking ATM, Sarah. Don't tell him anything." Daniel's brow furrowed. What could they mean? Margaret's voice dropped to a near whisper, but it still carried an unmistakable edge. "Once the papers are signed and you get your share, you'll have your freedom. You won't need him, or his approval, anymore. File for child support, and take what's rightfully yours." Daniel's heart stopped. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He stood frozen, every muscle tense, straining to hear more. "Mom," Sarah whispered, sounding distressed, "this feels wrong." "Stop it," Margaret hissed. "You're overthinking. He's already signed up for this, whether he knows it or not." Daniel's world began to unravel. His wife, his partner, his confidant, was conspiring with her mother to deceive him. To manipulate his love, his resources, and his trust. He stepped back from the door, careful not to make a sound. His mind raced. The child wasn't his. Daniel sat in his car in the driveway, staring blankly at the dashboard. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the soft leather. The words he overheard echoed in his mind, each repetition like a blade carving deeper into his chest. Walking ATM, child support. The baby's not his. He had replayed the scene in his head a dozen times already. Maybe he misunderstood. Maybe they weren't talking about him, about the baby. Yet the sinking weight in his gut told him otherwise. He glanced back at the house, its cheerful exterior now a mockery of the life he thought he was building. He needed answers. But the timing had to be right. Storming inside, demanding explanations, would yield nothing but lies. If Sarah and Margaret were plotting against him, they wouldn't admit it under pressure. Daniel exhaled shakily, flipping open the console to retrieve his phone. His fingers hovered over the contact list before settling on a name, Elliot Monroe. Elliot was an old college friend turned private investigator. They hadn't spoken in months, but Daniel knew the call would be worth it. "Hey, man," Elliot answered after the second ring, his voice tinged with curiosity. "It's been a while." "Yeah, too long," Daniel replied, forcing his tone to remain steady. "Listen, I need a favor. It's sensitive." There was a pause on the other end, then Elliot's voice dropped an octave. "Sensitive how?" "Spousal," Daniel admitted, the word sour in his mouth. "Can you meet me tonight?" By the time Elliot arrived at the quiet cafe downtown, Daniel had nursed his second coffee into a cold puddle. The investigator slid into the booth, his sharp eyes scanning Daniel's face. "You look like hell," Elliot said, waving at the waitress for a cup of black coffee. "Thanks for coming," Daniel muttered. He handed over a napkin, on which he had scrawled notes and names. I need you to find out what's really going on. If it's true. If the baby's not mine. Elliot skimmed the list. Margaret's name is here. You think your mother-in-law's involved? I heard her. She's practically coaching Sarah through this. Daniel's voice cracked, and he cleared his throat, struggling to maintain composure. I need proof. Solid proof. Elliot tucked the napkin into his pocket and leaned back. If what you suspect is true, you're going to need more than proof. You need a plan. You have assets, right? A joint account? Daniel nodded, his stomach twisting as he realized where this conversation was heading. First thing, Elliot said, leaning forward, secure your finances. No joint accounts. No loans. Nothing she can claim later. Start moving assets into protected accounts before they pull the rug out from under you. Daniel's mind raced. The thought of taking defensive measures against Sarah felt like betrayal, until he remembered Margaret's sharp-edged voice. Once the papers are signed, you'll have your freedom. Okay, Daniel said finally. What's next? I'll start digging. I need access to her phone records, bank accounts, social media. Elliot gave him a hard look. This could get messy, Dan. You sure you're ready for what I might find? Daniel didn't answer. His silence said everything. The following days passed in a blur. Daniel went through the motions, masking the turmoil beneath a veneer of normalcy. Sarah noticed his distant demeanor, but he attributed it to work stress, a lie she accepted with surprising ease. Elliot's updates came in like the ticking of a clock, each one building the tension. Phone logs showing late-night calls to numbers Daniel didn't recognize. Bank statements with cash withdrawals that didn't align with their household expenses. And then, 2 days later, the smoking gun, a string of text messages exchanged between Sarah and a man identified only as Jason. Elliot shared screenshots over a secure email. The messages were damning. Jason, how long can we keep this up? Won't he notice something's off? Sarah, he's oblivious. We'll get through the pregnancy, and then I'll do what Mom says. Jason, I just want us to be a family. Without him. Sarah, we will be. Soon. Daniel stared at the messages, his chest tightening with each word. He had to fight the urge to confront her immediately. Elliot's voice echoed in his mind, you need a plan. That night, Daniel lay awake in the darkened bedroom, listening to Sarah's steady breathing. Her hand rested protectively on her belly, the sight of it stirring a cocktail of emotions he could barely name. Love, anger, betrayal, sadness. They churned inside him, threatening to boil over. What kind of person could orchestrate such a lie? Who was this Jason? And what gave them the right to rip apart the life Daniel had worked so hard to build? He had his proof. Now came the hard part, deciding what to do with it. Daniel watched Sarah from across the dining table, his fork moving food around his plate without purpose. The dinner felt like an elaborate performance, both of them playing their parts. Sarah smiled, asked about his day, and spoke about a trip to the obstetrician next week. Everything seemed normal, too normal. But Daniel knew the truth now. The messages, the late-night calls, her sudden insistence on yoga classes and weekend outings with friends. He couldn't look at her the same way. Every smile, every touch, every word felt tainted. What's wrong? Sarah asked, her fork paused halfway to her mouth. Daniel blinked, pulling himself out of his thoughts. Oh, nothing. Just tired. You've been so stressed lately, she said, concern in her voice. Maybe you need to take a day off, unwind. Daniel forced a smile. Maybe you're right. The words were hollow, but they seemed to satisfy her. As she cleared the plates, humming softly to herself, Daniel's mind churned. He thought about Jason, the stranger who had intruded on his life, the man who Sarah spoke to in hushed tones. Who was he? And why hadn't Daniel seen it coming? That night, while Sarah slept, Daniel began his own investigation. He logged into their shared computer and accessed her cloud storage, something she'd forgotten to secure with a password. It was almost too easy. Among the mundane photos and documents were folders labeled innocuously, work, baby stuff, recipes. But a deeper search revealed a hidden folder. Its name was a jumble of letters and numbers, an attempt to disguise it as a system file. Inside, Daniel found more messages, photos, and videos. There was Jason, standing shirtless on a beach, his arms around Sarah. Another photo showed the two of them in a cozy cafe, her hand resting on his. The timestamps told a damning story. The affair wasn't new. It had been going on for at least a year, predating the pregnancy announcement. One video clip stood out. It was from just 2 months ago. In it, Jason and Sarah sat together on a couch, laughing about something off camera. Jason leaned in, kissing her neck, and Sarah whispered, "I can't wait for this to all be over. We'll finally have our family." Daniel closed the laptop, his hands trembling. The weight of their deception pressed down on him. This wasn't a lapse in judgment or a moment of weakness. It was a calculated betrayal, months in the making. Elliot's phone rang early the next morning. "I need you to find Jason," Daniel said, skipping any pleasantries. "Already ahead of you," Elliot replied. "His name is Jason Holt. Lives in the city, works in real estate. Been digging into him since those texts showed up. The guy's a snake." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, gripping the phone tightly. "He's got a record. A couple of fraud charges that didn't stick, likely thanks to expensive lawyers. Also, he's been sued for unpaid child support. Twice. This guy's bad news, Dan." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Send me everything you have." "Careful," Elliot warned. "You're already neck deep. Don't do anything stupid." Daniel ended the call without replying. He wasn't sure what he'd do yet, but he knew he couldn't let Jason walk away unscathed. By the time Sarah left for another prenatal yoga class, Daniel had formulated a plan. He followed her, keeping a safe distance, his car blending in with the morning traffic. Sure enough, she didn't head to the yoga studio. Instead, she drove downtown, parking in front of a boutique hotel. Jason appeared minutes later, striding out of the building in a casual blazer and jeans. He greeted Sarah with a kiss, his hand lingering on her stomach, a gesture that made Daniel's blood boil. They went inside together, oblivious to the man watching from across the street. Daniel waited. The minutes ticked by, each one stoking the fire of his anger. After nearly an hour, the pair emerged, laughing and holding hands. Jason opened the passenger door of his car for Sarah, an easy smile on his face. "This is the man she wants to raise my child with." Daniel thought bitterly. "No. Not my child. His." He followed them to a trendy cafe, then to a park, where they strolled leisurely, their body language exuding intimacy. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened with each passing moment. That evening, Sarah returned home, her demeanor light and carefree. She kissed Daniel on the cheek as though nothing had happened. "How was yoga?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. "Good," she replied, her smile faltering for a split second. "Really relaxing. I needed that." Daniel nodded, masking his fury. That night, he sat in the garage, going through Elliot's latest findings on Jason. It was worse than he expected. Jason's debts were staggering. He owed tens of thousands in back taxes and had several liens against his properties. The man was drowning in financial trouble, a stark contrast to the life of stability Daniel had worked so hard to build. It was clear now. Jason wasn't just after Sarah, he was after everything Daniel had. His wife. His child. His money. The rage that simmered in Daniel's chest began to coalesce into something cold and deliberate. He wouldn't just expose their lies. He'd dismantle them, piece by piece. The next morning, Daniel woke early, his decision made. He kissed Sarah goodbye as she left for her appointment, then sat down at his desk. The first call was to his lawyer, a shrewd man known for his expertise in high-stakes divorce cases. "Mr. Harper," the lawyer greeted. "What can I do for you?" "I need to protect my assets," Daniel said, his voice steady. "And I need it done yesterday." The lawyer didn't ask questions. By noon, Daniel's finances were locked down, his accounts shifted to private holdings. Joint accounts were drained, with enough left behind to avoid suspicion. Next, Daniel filed a request for a paternity test, citing personal concerns. He wanted irrefutable proof of Jason's connection to the baby. Finally, he sent an anonymous tip to Jason's employer, detailing the man's legal troubles. If Jason thought he could stroll into Daniel's life without consequences, he was about to learn otherwise. As the day wore on, Daniel felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The pieces were in motion. Now, all he had to do was wait. The cafe was quiet that evening, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the walls. Daniel sat at a corner table, his coffee untouched as he stared at the photos spread before him. Jason and Sarah smiling at the park, hands intertwined. Jason leaning protectively toward her as she held her belly. Each image burned into Daniel's mind like a searing brand. Across from him, Elliot sipped his black coffee, watching Daniel's reaction carefully. "You've got options," Elliot said finally, setting his mug down. "But none of them are easy." Daniel looked up, his jaw tight. "Lay them out." Elliot pulled a notepad from his pocket, flipping through pages of scribbled notes. "First, you could confront her. Put it all out there and see how she reacts. Best case, she comes clean, and you sort it out like adults. Worst case, she denies everything, doubles down, and you're stuck in a standoff." Daniel shook his head. "Not an option. If I confront her now, she'll run straight to Jason, and I'll lose any leverage." "Thought you'd say that," Elliot said with a grim smile. "Option 2, go nuclear. Lawyer up, drop the evidence, and blow her world apart. Divorce, custody battle, the works." "And the baby?" Daniel asked, his voice heavy with emotion. "Even if it's not mine, do I just walk away?" Elliot hesitated. "That's something only you can decide. But there's a third option." Daniel leaned in, his interest piqued. "You fight fire with fire," Elliot said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You turn the tables. Use what you've got to cut them off at the knees. Make them think twice about crossing you." That night, Daniel returned home with a plan. Sarah was in the living room, flipping through baby catalogs and humming softly to herself. She looked up as he walked in, her smile warm but tired. "Hey," she said. "You're home late." "Work ran over," Daniel replied, dropping his briefcase by the door. "What about you? How was your day?" Sarah hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. "Good. Just the usual errands." Daniel nodded, suppressing the wave of anger that rose in his chest. The lies flowed so easily from her lips now. He forced a smile. "Why don't I cook tonight? You deserve a break." Her eyes lit up. "Really? That sounds wonderful." As he prepared dinner, Daniel's mind churned. He was done playing the victim. If Sarah and Jason thought they could manipulate him, they were in for a rude awakening. The first step of his plan unfolded 2 days later. Daniel arranged a meeting with Sarah's obstetrician, under the guise of wanting to be more involved in the pregnancy. The doctor was hesitant at first, citing patient confidentiality, but Daniel's genuine concern, backed by his request for a paternity test, won her over. "This isn't about doubting Sarah," Daniel explained. "It's about making sure everything's right for the baby. I just need to be sure." The doctor agreed, scheduling a test for the following week. Daniel left the clinic with a glimmer of hope. Whatever the results, they would bring clarity. Meanwhile, Daniel turned his attention to Jason. He followed the man's every move, his hatred simmering just below the surface. Jason was everything Daniel despised, arrogant, reckless, and oblivious to the damage he was causing. One evening, Daniel parked outside Jason's office, watching as the man emerged with his phone pressed to his ear. Jason's face was animated, his free hand gesturing wildly as he spoke. Daniel recognized that look, the confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. But Daniel knew better. Jason's world was already starting to crumble. Earlier that day, Daniel had sent a package to Jason's employer, meticulously curated dossier of the man's financial troubles, legal issues, and incriminating photos with Sarah. By now, it would be sitting on the desk of Jason's boss, raising questions that Jason wouldn't be able to answer. Daniel smiled grimly. Step 2 was underway. At home, Sarah began to notice the change in Daniel. He was more attentive, more involved. He asked questions about the baby, about her day, about the future. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a husband trying to reconnect. But to Sarah, it felt off. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Daniel turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he said. "About us. About the baby." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Oh. I want to do things right," he continued. "Be the best father I can be. Maybe even take some time off work once the baby's here." Sarah forced a smile, her stomach twisting with guilt. "That's amazing, Daniel. The baby's lucky to have you." For a moment, she believed the words. But the way Daniel looked at her, so calm, so calculating, made her uneasy. She excused herself to the bedroom, her mind racing. 2 days later, Daniel received a call from Elliot. "The paternity test results are in," Elliot said. "Want me to grab them for you?" "No," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "I'll handle this myself." When Daniel picked up the envelope from the clinic, his hands trembled. He sat in his car for what felt like hours, staring at the seal. Finally, he tore it open, his eyes scanning the document. The results were clear, the child wasn't his. Daniel exhaled, his emotions a chaotic storm. Relief mingled with grief, anger with resignation. He folded the paper carefully, slipping it into his pocket. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. That night, Daniel set the stage for his final move. He invited Sarah to dinner at her favorite restaurant, insisting it was a celebration of their future. She hesitated but eventually agreed, charmed by his apparent devotion. As they sat across from each other, candles flickering between them, Daniel raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, his smile masking the storm within. Sarah clinked her glass against his, her own smile cautious. "To new beginnings." But as she sipped her wine, her phone buzzed on the table. Daniel's eyes flicked to the screen, catching a glimpse of Jason's name. Sarah quickly flipped the phone over, her cheeks flushing. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his smile fading. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and firm. Sarah froze, her glass halfway to her lips. "What about?" Daniel locked eyes with her, his gaze unyielding. "Everything." The soft hum of the restaurant faded into the background as Daniel's words hung in the air. Sarah set her glass down carefully, her fingers trembling. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of his intent. "What do you mean, everything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The flickering candlelight danced across his face, casting shadows that made his expression unreadable. "I know about Jason," he said flatly, his tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. "I know about the texts. The meetings. I know the baby isn't mine." Sarah's breath hitched, her face going pale. She opened her mouth to respond, but Daniel raised a hand, silencing her. "Don't," he said. "This isn't a conversation. This is me telling you what happens next." Her eyes widened. "Daniel, please, let me." "Save it," he cut her off, his voice sharp enough to slice through the air. "You've lied enough. Now, you're going to listen." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Slowly, deliberately, he unfolded it and slid it across the table. Sarah stared at it, dread pooling in her stomach. "This is a paternity test," Daniel said, his voice steady but laced with cold anger. "It confirms what you already know. The child you're carrying is Jason's." Sarah's hand covered her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. Daniel's laughter was cold, devoid of humor. "You never wanted to hurt me? Then why did you do it? Was I just a paycheck to you? A convenient fallback while you played house with Jason?" "It wasn't like that," Sarah pleaded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you." "So you didn't," Daniel snapped. "You decided to trap me instead. Let me believe the child was mine, let me pour my time, my energy, my love into a lie." Sarah's tears fell harder, but Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "I've spent weeks preparing for this," he continued, his voice eerily calm. "Every account we share. Closed. Every financial tie. Cut. You won't be getting a dime from me, not now, not ever." Her sobs grew louder, attracting a few curious glances from nearby tables. "Daniel, please," she begged, reaching across the table for his hand. "We can fix this. I made a mistake, but I still love you." Daniel pulled his hand back as if her touch burned him. "Love?" He shook his head, incredulous. "Don't you dare use that word. Not after what you've done." He leaned back in his chair, letting her anguish settle before delivering his final blow. "As of tomorrow morning, I'll be filing for divorce. I've already spoken to my lawyer, and the papers are ready. I suggest you read them carefully because they make one thing very clear: you and Jason are on your own." By the time they left the restaurant, Sarah was a wreck. Her makeup was smudged, her steps unsteady. Daniel walked her to the car without a word, opening the door and waiting for her to get in. As he closed the door, he leaned in. Good luck, Sarah. You'll need it. The drive home was silent, the tension between them thick enough to cut. Sarah tried several times to speak, but each attempt faltered under Daniel's stony silence. When they arrived, he went straight to the guest room, leaving her alone in the emptiness of their shared bedroom. The following morning, Daniel awoke to find Sarah gone. Her car was missing from the driveway, and the house was eerily quiet. He sat at the dining table, sipping his coffee and reviewing the next steps with his lawyer. She'll fight back, his lawyer warned. People like her always do. Daniel nodded. Let her. She has no leverage. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and preparations. By evening, Elliot called with an update on Jason. Your little dossier hit its mark, Elliot said with a chuckle. Jason's boss fired him this morning. Apparently, they don't take kindly to employees with outstanding lawsuits and a reputation for fraud. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. Good. One more thing, Elliot added. Jason's been trying to reach Sarah all day. Seems like he's panicking. Let him panic, Daniel replied. They deserve each other. That night, as Daniel sat alone in the living room, the weight of everything finally settled on him. The anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it all came crashing down in a wave that left him breathless. He picked up his phone, hesitating before dialing Elliot's number. Hey, Elliot answered. Everything okay? Daniel stared at the flickering flames in the fireplace, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Yeah. It's over. Elliot was silent for a moment, then said, You did the right thing, Dan. It's going to hurt for a while, but you'll come out stronger. Daniel nodded, even though Elliot couldn't see him. Thanks, man. For everything. As he hung up, Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting the silence envelop him. The life he thought he had was gone, but in its place was something new, something raw and uncertain, but his. The reckoning was complete. Now, he could begin to rebuild.